Good morning, New Gen. I hope you're all doing well as we gather together this morning in our Sunday fellowship groups. My name is Helena and I am part of the leadership team here at New Gen. So we are in a series called God and South Africa. Last week, Wes kicked us off, and every week we are looking at particular topics relevant to us living in South Africa. Last week, Wes spoke about God and social justice, or actually social injustices here in South Africa. If you missed that, I really want to encourage you to go take a look at that and catch it up. If you weren't there, you'll find the link to that on our website under resources, so you can catch it up there. And this morning, we are going to talk about God and our leaders. Now, I wonder what kind of reactions and responses went on in your groups as I said that. Maybe some cynical snorts, maybe some crossing of the arms, rolling of the eyes, some knowing looks shared, some suppressed sighs or groans. I think that I can quite confidently say that as people living in South Africa, we have a less than positive outlook on the way our country is led currently. And there's probably also a whole range of reactions and emotions towards the elections coming up this Wednesday, not far off now. Maybe some of you can't vote because you're under 18, or maybe because you're not a South African citizen. Maybe some of you are so excited about this, and the prospect of making a difference with your vote really gets you excited. Maybe you think that, yes, this is it. This is the election that will change everything. Maybe some of you are feeling pretty indifferent and you're thinking, you know, if anything, this is a very welcome off day. Or if you're parents, maybe it's a day of inconvenience and frustration because what are we going to do with the kids? Maybe you're thinking it's just another obligation, the right thing to do, tick it off the list. But really, what difference is it going to make? Maybe you're not voting because you feel, what is the point? So amongst all of those, maybe I've missed some responses and reactions, but where would you put yourself? Maybe even you are approaching it with a sense of stoic sense of responsibility and duty, thinking, you know, you've done your research and you've come to your conclusions and this is the way forward. I just want to take a moment and say that I am by no means a political activist. To a large extent, I'm actually quite ignorant when it comes to a lot of our country's political nuances and intricacies. I know the elections are coming up on Wednesday, but I have no intention with this message to convince you of anything or to persuade you to vote this way or that way, or to show, you know, this is how you vote as a believer, as a Christian. I'm not going to be pulling apart all the different political parties and their leaders and analyzing the manifestos or anything like that. What I'm hoping to do with this message is draw out a godly perspective and a biblical view and a gospel response when it comes to how we, as people living in South Africa, relate to our leaders. So in preparing this message, I was trying to think of a title other than God and our leaders. And if you were at Together Sunday last week, you would have heard this word, and this word really stuck with me. So I've decided to title this The Stability of Our Times. And this comes from Isaiah 55, verse 3-5. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion with justice and righteousness, and he will be the stability of your times, abundance of salvation, wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure. No doubt, the last word that comes to mind when we think of South African politics is stable or stability, am I right? It's no secret that the people of South Africa really don't have a lot of faith or hope in our current leadership of the country. There is so much disdain and disappointment and discontentment going around now. I was sent this comic earlier this week. Maybe some of you have seen it. The one character says, "Do all fairy tales begin with once upon a time?" And Charlie Brown answers, "No, many of them begin with, if I'm elected, I promise." So I live in Salaris Pass, and lately there has been a great effort to brighten the village up with some beautiful murals and street art. And this was one of the latest additions and artworks that I've seen. It says, "Grow vegetables, don't elect them." So just a quick sidebar, but don't you love the South African sense of humor? I think it's quite unique, and sure, a lot of it is a coping mechanism to get through a lot of really tough subjects and issues. But at least we can find some comic relief in all the load shedding memes and the Trevor Noah anecdotes. One article I read in the Daily Maverick starts like this and says, "If there is a universal shield against the blows of life, stupidity, and the grinding teeth of bureaucracy and politics, it is humor." And I can really appreciate that about this nation. Anyways, back on track. Earlier this month, we sent out a short anonymous questionnaire. You might have been sent it and come across it, and if you filled it out, thank you so much. It really helped. We tried to send it far and wide across many demographics to really get our sample group as diverse as possible. And the results across the board were unsurprising. One of the questions asked to describe the leadership of this country, or the leading of this country, in 2 words. And can you guess what the most commonly used word was when it came to this question? Corrupt. Other words that came through often were incompetent, unreliable, untrustworthy, and selfish. That is really not a pretty picture. I think the kindest and most generous words used was "they're trying," and there is room for improvement. So with the looming elections, we've also been bombarded with all kinds of political posters up and down the streets, on lampposts, saying things like "rescue South Africa," "fix South Africa," "let's rebuild," "let's restore." And it's all highlighting the same thing, isn't it? It's highlighting the sentiment that something is wrong. Our country is in danger. Something is broken. Something needs to be fixed. There is a problem, and we need a rescuer and a savior. There's even this anticipation that this will be the election that changes things, you know, that something is going to happen in the political sphere that will cause a change and that will make a difference. News outlets are claiming things that this vote could be the one that propels the opposition parties into power. And journalists are suggesting that South Africa could be facing a turning point. However you read it, it seems that there is a unanimous dissatisfaction and discontentment with how our country is being led. And there's a desperation to see things change. Last week, as part of Wes's message, he outlined a pretty bleak list of the social injustices in South Africa. And I think we can agree on some of the things that are wrong with our country. Corruption and poverty are at the top of that list. One response to this questionnaire said this: "I was taught to never discuss religion and politics, both of which are inferred in this questionnaire." And that's true, both were inferred in that questionnaire. And I don't blame this kind of response. To be honest, I think many of us were taught this, that politics and religion don't mix. Both can be such polarizing and sensitive subjects, and I'm sure for a lot of you avoid it at social gatherings and maybe even the cause of some heated debate in your family WhatsApp groups. So then, if religion and politics don't mix, where is God in all of this? Is he involved in every aspect of our lives except politics? Does he care about our families and our relationships, but he stays away from government? Is he concerned about our health and our joy, but is he ignorant and indifferent toward the country's leaders? Is he actively using his people to advance his kingdom and grow his church? But he keeps them away from politics. Does he hold the stars in the palm of his hands? And does he use the mountains as his footstool? But he stays out of the leading of a nation that he created. No, I believe that God has a lot to say about this, and that we do have a way to respond. So we are going to look through the Bible and through a little bit of Israel's history about how did God intervene? How was God involved in a nation's leading and in government and in politics? And reading it and kind of getting a handle of what Israel's history looked like with this particular lens on, it reads like a political roller coaster. It's really all over the place. And it was so interesting. There are so many lessons to pull out of the Old Testament and of Israel's history. And one major thing, one very obvious thing, is that God just not for one moment was God passive and uninterested and uninvolved in the political sphere. And so hopefully through looking at some of this, we can pull out some helpful perspectives and principles. And it'll become clear that God's people from the Old Testament faced some really rocky times when it came to their leaders. And I think often we can relate. But let's not make the mistake. It is God who appoints a leader. And it's God who puts someone into a position of power. And it is also God who decides when that person's rule or reign is over according to God's will. We're going to pause here for a moment, and some scriptures are going to appear on the screen, and I'm going to ask you guys to choose some people in your groups to read some of these scriptures out to the rest of the group, and then you are going to discuss very briefly about what stands out, what is the big idea, what's the main point to take out of these scriptures. Great. I hope that you guys could see from those scriptures that we can see who's in control. We can see who's got the ultimate authority and power. So let's now take a look at a few specific people in positions of power from Israel's history, from the Old Testament, and we're going to see how God uses various leaders in various different positions to ultimately fulfill his plan and his purposes, and to fulfill his promises. So let's start with Abraham. And you remember the promise that God made to Abraham. He promised that he would make him into a great nation. He will be the father of a multitude. Kings will come from him. He promised to be Abraham's God and also to be a God to his descendants. He promised them land, the land of Canaan, to belong to them, the promised land. So we're going to fast forward quite quickly through some of the history. It's familiar stories, and sometimes I find it so helpful to zoom out and to look at it from a broad view, a bigger perspective. So we're not going to get into the details of the story. I had a lot of help from the Bible Project to try to help me kind of piece it together and to see kind of an amazing big story that comes through these well-known stories in the Bible. So Abraham, God made a promise to him, and miraculously in Abraham's old age he has a son and calls him Isaac. Isaac then has a son named Jacob, and Jacob goes on and he has 12 sons, the youngest of which is Joseph. So Abraham's family is growing, son and another son and another son, they have kids, and so the family is growing, but it's not a multitude yet as God promised to Abraham. Okay, so now we're looking at Joseph. Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat. He's been called many things, Joseph the Dreamer. So you'd remember that story as well. If there are kids here, I'm sure you guys also remember this story. So he had all these dreams, and the dreams were of his brothers and even of his parents bowing down to him. His brothers all really didn't like him. He was very obviously his father's favorite. He even got given by his father this glamorous, fantastic Technicolor coat. And I don't know what the equivalent today would be, maybe a car. So little brother gets given something that no one else in the family gets given. They're not getting along so well. And so Joseph's brothers, they are not liking the sound of their little brother's dreams, of them bowing down to him. So they make a plan to get rid of him. And to make a long story short, he ends up being sold as a slave, and he ends up in Egypt. While in Egypt, he is sold to Potiphar. Potiphar is a very powerful ruler in Egypt. And he starts serving in his house as a slave, but it is obvious that God's hand is on him. God's favor is on him, and he works well. And it says in the word, he becomes a successful man. And Potiphar could see God's blessing on Joseph and everything he did. So Joseph found favor in Potiphar's sight, and then he was put in charge of the whole household. We continue reading and we see then that his life is very much like this. And now on a down point, he's falsely accused of something. He is sent to prison. He sits there for 2 years. And again, to make a long story short, 2 years later only is he let out, and he is face to face with the king of Egypt, with Pharaoh, to interpret a dream, or dreams that Pharaoh had. And Pharaoh ends up being so impressed by Joseph's interpretation of his dreams that he puts him in charge, not just of his household, but over the whole of Egypt. So Pharaoh is the mightiest in the land, and just below Pharaoh is Joseph. He goes from slave to prisoner to supervisor. And the dreams that God had given Pharaoh were of years of famine and lack. But before those years, there will be years of abundance and food and rich fields. And this was to warn Pharaoh of what was coming. So a famine was coming, but before the famine, there would be years of abundance. And during those years, they would need to store up food for the years of lack. And then reading on in that story, we see that it wasn't only Egypt that had famine in that time. It was all the surrounding lands as well, including where Joseph's father Jacob and his brothers lived. Again, to shorten the story slightly, Jacob, Joseph's father, and his brothers end up coming to Egypt from their land because the famine was so severe and they were in danger of starving. So they come to Egypt looking for food. Here they encounter Joseph. They don't encounter the down and out, sold as a slave Joseph. No, they encounter the successful, thriving, powerful ruler Joseph. This is their little brother that they sold as a slave, that is now this powerful ruler in Egypt. In Genesis 45:8, Joseph tells his brothers, "It was not you that sent me here, but God." Joseph has compassion on his brothers and tells them in Genesis 50 verse 20, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." So then they are reunited, they are reconciled, Joseph with his brothers and his father. And then eventually Jacob moves his whole family from outside of Egypt. They move into Egypt. And we read that at this point there are about 70 people in total. So you can already see the family is growing. Still not a multitude that was promised to Abraham, but the family is growing. At some point in this, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And these people, this growing family that have now moved into Egypt, they become known as the Israelites. And so the Israelites are given land in Egypt. They gained possessions in it. They were fruitful and they multiplied in Egypt. So let's pause here. In this big story, can you see how God used both Pharaoh, a pagan king, and Joseph, a godly man, to save Egypt, not only Egypt, but also to preserve his family, the family of God, the family through which God's promises would be fulfilled, the family through which the whole earth would be blessed. So then, many years later, Joseph has passed away, his father, his brothers have passed away, Pharaoh has died, and a new Pharaoh has now started to rule. The Pharaoh that knew Joseph and that had a good relationship with Joseph and his family, he's died, and there is now a new Pharaoh on the throne. And we read in Exodus 1, verse 8 to 14. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So here now there's this new authority dealing so differently with God's people than a previous ruler, a previous king. Where they had favor, now they've got oppression. Meanwhile, despite their harsh treatment as slaves, God's people are spreading, they are growing, they are multiplying, they're growing stronger. And now God sets in motion his plan to set his people free out of Egypt and out of a life of slavery. He used the boundaries of Egypt to protect his people from starvation. But now he needs to move his people out of Egypt and away from oppression as slaves. So he's used one Pharaoh's reign in one way, and he's using another Pharaoh's reign to accomplish something else. So in comes Moses. He is saved from the Nile, and he's raised in Pharaoh's home, this Pharaoh's home that wants nothing to do with God's people and wants to eradicate them. So he grows up in this Pharaoh's home, but he never forgets that he is part of God's people. He belongs to Israel. Through a series of mistakes and mishaps, he flees Egypt to preserve his life, and he settles in the desert. And he settles down to a quiet life as a shepherd. And then one day he has a radical encounter with God through a burning bush. I'm sure that story is familiar to most of us. God calls him to confront Pharaoh and to free his people from slavery. Eventually, Moses does decide to trust God, and he returns back to Egypt. And there, through the 10 plagues, God shows his unmatched power, and his people are saved, and they are led to freedom out of Egypt. But it was far from smooth sailing from that point on. We know from there, God's people end up wandering in the desert for years and years. They finally enter the promised land. Then they demand to have a king. They want a king over them. And that goes horribly wrong and ends in the division of Israel as a kingdom. It splits into two, the north and the south. And there are some awful, really, truly awful and terrible kings that rule and reign over them, with a handful of good ones in there. And this leads to Israel's defeat and exile into Babylon. And then eventually from Babylon, they make their way back also through many kings that God uses, God guides without them realizing it. God uses these kings, pagan and godly kings, to guide them back into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and the city walls. So we can see how political giants and governmental forces were being guided by God without them realizing it. And not for their sake, but for God and his people. John Piper says, God wields an empire to fulfill his word and to bless his children. God used the first Pharaoh with Joseph to save his people from famine. And then later on, God uses the next Pharaoh with Moses to save his people from complacency and dependence on Egypt. God continues to use kings and leaders to save his people, either from attack and hardship from their enemies, or from their own sin and wickedness. It might seem like these evil kings are being allowed to have their way, but there's actually something so much bigger going on. God is still in control. God's concern is still for his people and their salvation. So, can we trust God's providence even when things are looking really bad? Can we trust in God's guiding even if it looks like he's not working? Can we hope that no matter how hard it gets or how bad it looks or how confusing and chaotic things seem, that God is committed to redeeming his world and keeping his promises? We need to hold on to this perspective that God is sovereign, God is in control. He is the stability of our times. He sees the full picture. We only see a snapshot. Isaiah 55 verse 8 to 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Let's not for a moment idolize a mere human and put sinful man in the place of God and think that even a better ruler or a better leader can do what only God can do. A person cannot solve our problems, no matter how many good boxes they tick. And don't think for a moment that a person can do what only God can do. For example, one of the kings of Israel was King Solomon. And he did amazing, incredible, wonderful things for God. He was committed to God. He was a godly man. He ruled with justice. He ruled with such wisdom and discernment. And he was known for knowing how to deal with really tough situations. He's credited with overseeing the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. He's also credited with writing many biblical texts, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. And it's said that during his reign, Israel experienced a season of incredible prosperity and wealth and peace. Unfortunately, his later reign was marred by idolatry and wrong political alliances with foreign women, which led to more idolatry and him leading God's people to worship false idols and foreign gods instead of the one true God. And this led to the division of Israel as a kingdom. So even the best earthly leaders will disappoint because they're ultimately only human. So how do we respond as Christians, as believers, as Christ followers, as the saints? What is our role here? Do we have a role when it comes to politics? Do we flee the country and be done with it? Do we join the cynical and judgmental rants, whether it's online or physical? Do we frantically and feverishly lobby and petition and try and make a change with our own physical energy and hands? Do we throw up our hands helplessly and say, it is, what a mess? I want to suggest 3 ways that we can respond. First, we look up, then we look in, and then we look out. So first we look up, and again, I am going to ask you to pause the video here, and some scriptures are going to appear on the screen again. And again, I want you to nominate a couple of people to read these scriptures. And again, you are going to briefly discuss what is the main point, what stands out. Let's go for it. Our hope is not in the democratic system of South Africa. Our faith is not in the promises of any political party. Our confidence is not in improved infrastructure or a healthy economy. Our trust is not in a better political leader. At the Advanced Global Conference that we were recently at, one of the team leaders spoke on King Hezekiah and his how he dealt with the conflict with the Assyrians. And he said this, and it just sums it up so succinctly. Our confidence and our courage in this conflict is in Christ. No matter how convincing or how persuasive people are, they will disappoint. We can't place eternal hope on people. No matter what they say, these political parties cannot fix South Africa like they are claiming they can. They can't save this nation, no matter how hard they try. Political leaders, even the best ones, can't save us. They can't carry our burdens, and they can't heal our nation. No matter who is in office, God is still on his throne. We look to the one who is greater and sovereign and in control. Think of the old hymn. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ, the solid rock, I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. God is the stability of our times. When everything else feels like sinking sand, God is our solid rock and our solid foundation. So we look up. We look up to God. We look up to where our hope comes from. Next, we look in. We remind ourselves of who we are and where we belong. Philippians 3 verse 20 says, our citizenship is in heaven. In John 17, before Jesus is arrested and crucified, he prays and he says of his followers, of us, they are in the world, they are not of the world. In John 18 verse 36, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. As Christ followers, our alliance and our allegiance is first and foremost to Jesus and his eternal kingdom. Throughout the Bible, we are, as believers, as saints, we are described as voyagers, exiles, strangers, pilgrims, sojourners, foreigners, reminding us that this is not our end home. This is not, we do not belong to this world. We look forward to our true home one day with Jesus. And I love how this song by Thrice puts it. I am an exile, a sojourner, a citizen of some other place. All I've seen is just a glimmer in a shadowy mirror. But I know one day I'll see face to face. I am a pilgrim, a voyager. I won't rest until my lips touch the shore of the land that I've been longing for as long as I've lived, where there'll be no pain or tears anymore. My heart is filled with songs of forever, of a city that endures, where all is made new. I know I don't belong here. I'll never call this place my home. I'm just passing through. Consider how similar to the Israelites were saved from famine, saved from attacks, saved from slavery, saved from their own wickedness, weaknesses, and faithlessness, indifference, and sin. So are we saved by the greatest leader of all, the one with the highest authority in all the universe, the King of heaven and earth, Jesus, our ultimate example, our perfect example of leadership. He comes and saves us from our sin and gives us this new eternal citizenship. We are of the world. We are in the world. We are not of the world. This is not our final home. This is not our true home. So with that perspective, with that reality that we are citizens of heaven, that is where our identity is. We are with Jesus. We are in Jesus. Our alliance and our allegiance is with Jesus. So does that give us permission to be totally nonchalant and indifferent and careless towards what goes on in this world, in this life where our feet are walking these streets and we are living in homes here? Do we just say, well, we're not from here. This is not my problem. No. Next, we look out. And guess what? Again, you're going to pause and some scriptures are going to appear on the screen and you're going to read them through out loud in your groups and then discuss again, what are the main points? What are the things that are sticking out here? It is so clear that all of us as believers are called to pray for our leaders. It cannot be more clear in the scriptures. Besides for that, we are also, I believe, called to wise, faithful, discerning, and spirit-led engagement with the issues of our land and to care about those issues. But we need to be careful that it doesn't become an obsession or a distraction. The degree to which we get involved will be different from person to person, and how and where we get involved will depend largely on conviction and strengths and ability and where the Spirit is leading us and guiding us. I came across this paragraph while preparing and I thought it is put so well. In a world prone to panic, Christians will stand out as we choose to exemplify what trust in God looks like in all situations. When we choose to make ourselves subject to governing bodies, even those with whom we disagree, we give testimony to our belief that God is in charge. When we join in the world panic, however, we tell an equally reverberant story. But our hope was never in a political leader anyway, although admittedly some are easier to follow than others. Our hope has always been in God. Our current and future citizenship lies in His kingdom, and our allegiance belongs to Him. No matter what comes our way, we choose trust over panic. To borrow a phrase used by Mark Sayers, we need to be a non-anxious presence in this complicated and chaotic world. And this doesn't come from sheer determination and putting on a brave face and a plastic smile. No, this comes from a conviction, a deep conviction that God is the stability of our times. And this conviction can only come from spending time with that God, knowing that God, trusting that God, spending time in prayer and in His word, winning the day, seeking His face, reading His word, spending time with Jesus daily. So let's look up as we remember where our hope comes from. And then we look in and we remember who we are and where we belong. And we're going to end this morning by looking out. And we're going to split into groups of 3 and we're going to pray. We're going to do what the scripture tells us to do, and we're going to pray for our leaders, current as well as future. So let's look up and remember where our hope comes from. And then we look in and we remember who we are and where we belong. And then we look out. We're going to end this morning by looking out. We're going to do what scripture calls us to do, and we're going to pray for our leaders. So as we end off this morning, you guys are going to break into groups of 3 and prayer points are going to come up on the screen. And we are going to pray for our leaders together. And we're going to trust for God's hand to move and to intervene as we remember God is the stability of our times.